yo soy Lilian. Primeramente, me gustaría agradecer a Springer por este espacio para que nosotros podamos hablar un poquito de hoy. Entonces, ¿quién tiene la ID? Rápidamente, ¿quién tiene la ID? Mariana de Springer. Okay. Dos personas. En México nosotros somos 4.000 IDs. Entonces vamos a hablar un poquito entonces de qué es ORCID. ORCID entonces es una organización sin fines de lucro que está ahí, que tiene como misión ofertar un identificador de 16 dígitos que ayuda a los investigadores a colocar ahí todo que es su producción científica evita a cosa de los homónimos. Entonces, ¿cuántos, no sé, José Luis existe en el mundo? Y para que nosotros evitemos la duplicación y también la confusión de qué es la investigación de uno, qué investigación de otro, nosotros empezamos a trabajar con la ORCID. Entonces, nuestra primera misión es ofertar a la comunidad científica identificadores para distinguir cada investigación y cada dueño de investigación. Esto se tornó como un estándar que se puede utilizar para sus publicaciones, para requisición de becas, de todo que está vinculado al universo científico. Entonces, no somos global, estamos presentes en el mundo todo. Somos financiados por organizaciones como Springer y otros editores y también los centros de pesquisa y universidades, centros de investigación y universidades. Entonces, ¿qué es la ORCID? ¿Qué es la ID, la identificación? Nosotros somos un ID único y persistente de 16 dígitos. Es gratuito para investigadores, académicos y analistas. Entonces, si mete a página web, tú haces tu registro y recibes tu ORCID ID. Y desde ahí puedes subir toda su información, dónde la universidad está vinculado, qué tipo de financiamiento tiene, todos sus trabajos, y esta será su identificación donde quiera que vayas, donde quiera que trabajes, también donde quieren la identificación es posible utilizarla y todos sabrán que aquel trabajo y aquel nombre es tuyo. Como importante para todas las actividades profesionales, como hablé a poco, y nosotros estamos ahí como muy enfocados en garantizar que los flujos de trabajo sean más confiables y acurados posible. Entonces, nuestra misión también es garantizar para nuestros miembros y para los investigadores que toda información que flúa entre los miembros y los ayudantes de investigadores sea confiable. Este es como de verdad que 30 segundos de tu vida para hacer el registro. Entonces coloca ahí tu nombre, tu correo, recibes un correo ahí recibes un correo para confirma, métese ahí a alimentar su ORCID. Y desde ahí puedes utilizar su ORCID, por ejemplo, para someter sus trabajos a Springer. Eso es un primer paso que puede ser tu ORCID. Yo tengo que parar ahora porque María, es gratuito. Este servicio es gratuito para los investigadores y para la comunidad científica. No se cobra nada por eso. Y es una ventaja que puede utilizar como datos estandarizados para todo que sea vinculado a tu investigación. Pero yo tengo que parar ahora. Yo estoy por ahí en la feria, yo estoy con Springer, con todos los otros, con la gente por ahí y podemos hablar y me buscas, por favor.
Bien, muchas gracias, Lilian, por tu participación. Bueno, pues la idea es que tengamos gratuito y este número o identificador nos va a servir para registrar de manera única nuestros trabajos en las editoriales y como ya vieron, en Springer, Elsevier y en cualquiera de ellas. Entonces hay que generar y tramitar nuestro org aquí y ahí están las ligas. Bien, vamos entonces a presentar brevemente a nuestro expositor. Él es el doctor Daniel McGowan, Science Director en Edanz New Zealand. El doctor McGowan ha ganado diversos premios durante su carrera, incluyendo la beca postdoctoral Marie Curie. Ha trabajado en laboratorios investigando los mecanismos moleculares en el mal de Parkinson y la enfermedad de Huntington, combinando microdisección láser, análisis de microconjuntos y proteómica. El doctor McGowan posee un amplio conocimiento en enfermedades neurodegenerativas, zoología marina, biología celular y molecular, bioquímica proteica, cuenta con una vasta experiencia multidisciplinaria en laboratorio empleando técnicas tradicionales y contemporáneas, incluyendo proteómica, genómica, funcional e imágenes celulares. Sus excelentes habilidades de comunicación oral y escrita se muestran en sus múltiples publicaciones como primer autor, ya que de 2005 a octubre de 2006 el Dr. McGowan fue editor asociado en Nature Review Neuroscience antes de convertirse en editor de tiempo completo en Edanz Editing, donde actualmente funge como Group Science Director. Sin mayor preámbulo, demos la bienvenida a Daniel McGowan. Gracias.
Gracias. Buenas tardes a todos. Now I switch to English. So I will speak very slowly, and if I speak too quickly, please wave at me. I think we do have translation. Is that right? So I don't see many people with headsets, but if you need to run and get one, please do so. So I'm really pleased to be here in Mexico again, and this is the 4th year in a row now that Edanz has been a part of this event, so that's a real honour and privilege for us to be invited back again and again. For those of you who were maybe here last year and have seen this before, you know, hopefully there's some reinforcement there and it's not too dull to go over the same stuff. As you can see, the topic of my talk today, really I'm aiming to give you all some insights into publication success. So how to publish in international English language journals and you know, aiming for journals that perhaps have impact factors slightly higher than some of the journals you have published in before. Okay, so that's the topic. I know in the program it talks about biological and chemical sciences, but actually I think a lot of the tips I'm giving today are across the board, all fields. A lot of the examples I have are biomedical and so on. I'm not going to repeat the introduction we've just had, but I just want to make one point that I understand how difficult it is to be published as a researcher. I've been a researcher myself, as you've heard. I've also been a journal editor, so on the other side of that, actually making decisions about content and which articles to publish. And for me, you know, that was a really good opportunity to see what made some of the top scientists in the world, and I did work with some of the top neuroscientists in the world, including Nobel Prize winners during my time at the journal. What made them so successful in terms of publishing? So it gave me insights into that. And for the last 7 or 8 years, I've been with this company, Edanz, and so I'm the science director there, also head of medical writing, and we develop manuscripts every day for our clients in the medical writing business. And through our editing business, we work predominantly with non-native speakers of English, and we understand the challenges you will face, okay? So I think I just wanted to say that all the insights I talk about really come from a combination of those 3 things. Okay, I'm now going to step down off the stage so I can actually see my slides, because they're not in front of me. But I want to start by just giving a brief outline to my talk, okay? I think most of what I'm talking about today is being effective communicators of your science. It's all very well doing good quality science, but if you're not effectively communicating that to the scientific community, your job is not complete, okay? It needs to be communicated to the community. How do we do that? First of all, I think it's really important to write effectively. So not just correct grammar, you know, having English that is correct. It has to be effective in that it's getting your important key messages across, okay? And so I'm going to start by giving some tips about writing effectively. And I think there's actually a talk tomorrow also on this topic I saw in the program. It's really important to choose the best journal to target with your manuscript, and this is a really, really common reason for rejection. Okay, I see it all the time with our clients. People get rejected because they've submitted to a journal that's maybe not the best choice. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about choosing journals. And then it's really important to have a logical presentation. And by this I mean you need to tell a story. It's not just, this is what I did and these are the results. You have to kind of make a story. So I'm going to talk a bit about manuscript structure and how to organize your ideas logically. These days it's really competitive to get published in journals, okay? Journal editors receive a lot of submissions and they have to make decisions about which ones they want to send to peer review. So it's really important to make your submission to the journal stand out, okay? There's competition for publication space, so you need to convey the significance of your results to journal editors. And I'll talk a little bit about cover letters and how you can do that here. And then finally, because your job is not done when you've submitted your manuscript, I want to talk a bit about the peer review process, the challenges that can entail, but also how to overcome some of those challenges and things, some strategies you can apply when you're responding to peer review and revising your manuscript. Okay, so those are basically the sections of my talk today, six different sections I have. And just you'll see at the top here, actually it's cut off unfortunately. It looks like maybe the screen is not big enough. But there's actually, in case you hadn't guessed, a 5 at the end of that, so Mexico 2015. If you go to this URL, and it will pop up a few times during my talk, I have this URL, so if you miss it now, you can get it later. You can actually come and download my presentation from today, so you have a record of it. So you don't need to furiously write notes. Okay, so we're a bit behind time, so let's move on. We're late starting, but I want to start in this section on writing effectively about reader expectations. Okay, readers have certain expectations about where in a sentence or in a paragraph certain pieces of information should be. And the best writers are aware of these expectations and they take advantage of that awareness. They apply it to their own benefit by putting information where readers expect it to be, okay? And this contributes to what we call readability. So again, it's not about correct English in terms of the grammar. This is about being highly readable. We all know from reading a novel, a work of fiction, or even non-fiction as well, some writers are just very easy to read and understand. Some other writers, it's impossible. You have to reread sentences, scratch your head a little bit and think, what do they mean here? Okay, so we all know this. Good writers are aware of these expectations and take advantage of them. So what are they? So first of all, verb placement. Okay, readers expect that a verb will closely follow the subject in a sentence. And if you have a large separation between the two, it can lead to confusion. So the best thing to do is to move them close together in a sentence. And I'll give you an example here. The smallest of the URFs, blah, 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 lots of information here, has been identified. And often by the time we get to the verb down here, we've forgotten what the subject of the sentence is. It's a little bit confusing, and it can be simplified by breaking that very long sentence into 2 sentences. So here we have the verb and the subject a lot closer together, and all that additional information is in the subsequent sentence. It's much easier to read and understand. The next thing, and this is always controversial, is writing in the active voice as opposed to the passive voice. So I'm here to tell you that sentences that are written in the active voice are more direct, they're clearer and easier to read and understand. And I'll just give you some examples. So this is a sentence written in the passive voice. There's nothing really wrong with it, okay? The mechanisms regulating tumour growth were investigated, completely fine. But an active voice equivalent would be, we investigated the mechanisms regulating tumour growth. It's more direct. It's easier to read and understand. Now, while this isn't a bad sentence, Oftentimes, we see sentences that are much longer than they need to be and convoluted and difficult to understand because the authors felt they needed to use the passive voice and they needed to avoid using personal pronouns like I and we. And I know it is still taught that you should, in formal academic writing, you shouldn't use I and we, and you should always write in the passive voice. It's true that historically this was how academic writing was done, but over the last 10 to 15 years in particular, there's been a big move away from that and towards using the active voice. And if we look at some different style guides that journals will use, there's just 4 as examples. All of these recommend the use of the active voice wherever possible, okay? Because it's less wordy, it's more direct than passive voice. So there is no such rule that you should not use personal pronouns and that you should write in the passive voice. I've never seen that in a style guide anywhere, okay? Absolutely, there are places in your manuscript where you will use the passive voice, normally in the methods sections, for example. But where you have the alternative to use the active voice, it should be preferred, okay? The next thing I want to talk about is what's known as the stress position in a sentence. And I want to start by asking you all a question here. I want to see a show of hands from you all. So I want to know which of these 2 sentences I'm going to show you will strongly suggest that you will get a raise. Okay, so the first one is, you deserve a raise, but the budget is tight. And the second one is, the budget is tight, but you deserve a raise. So how many think the first of these more strongly suggest that you will get a raise? Okay, I see about 2 hands go up. It's either apathy or you all think the second one. So how many people here think the second one more strongly suggests that you'll get a raise? Right, many more hands. Certainly not everyone in the room has made a decision, but that's fine. We have many more choosing this option, and the reason for that is readers focus on information that is placed at the end of a sentence. Okay, so this is the stress position. And this is where you want to put the take-home information for the reader to remember. Okay, so that important information should go at the end of the sentence. Okay? This stress position also introduces the topic of the next sentence. So we can have a linkage from one sentence to the next. Okay, and this is what's known as the topic position at the beginning of a sentence, where you introduce what that sentence will be about. Alright, so we can logically go from one sentence to the next and so on throughout a paragraph, okay? And link sentences, it gives a logical flow to the manuscript so that the reader can easily read and understand where you're going. The same concept applies at the level of sentences as well. So within a paragraph, if we look at this figure here, imagine having one idea per sentence. And this is something else we recommend, okay? Just keeping your sentences simple. Don't try and have too many ideas all together in one sentence. Rather, break them up. So you have one idea per sentence, and you can link from one to the next as I've shown. Okay, and just to show you an example here, the patient went to the hospital to see a gastroenterologist. The doctor, clearly referring to the gastroenterologist, then performed a series of diagnostic tests. The results, referring to the results of these tests, and so on and so on. Okay, so we can logically flow through a paragraph, through our manuscript. We can link one sentence to the next. Okay, as I said, the same thing applies at the level of sentences. And so if you imagine now, instead of a topic position, we have a topic sentence at the beginning of a paragraph that introduces what that paragraph is going to be about. And then at the very end, we have a stress sentence that is the important take-home information that you want to read to remember. Okay, so we can use these same principles apply. And again, just as we link from one sentence to the next, we can link from one paragraph to another. I'm sure we've all here read manuscripts before where you read a paragraph about one thing and then suddenly the author's talking about something completely unrelated. And it's very confusing, and often then they come back to the first thing again and they're jumping around. It's very confusing to read and understand. And if you can keep this in mind, you can actually make the reader's job a lot easier. And I think it's important to try and do that, because you must remember many of your readers will also not be native English speakers. Okay, other countries within Latin America, all of Asia, lots of places in Europe as well, they're not native English speakers, so they need your writing to be effective and clear so they can understand what it is you're conveying. The final point I want to make on this topic of reader expectations is about using simple language. Okay, simple terms, where possible, should always be preferred over more complicated terms. Okay, I see this a lot, often with Japanese writers. Actually, we have a lot of clients in Japan, and they try to use these words that perhaps they think sound more impressive, and often they're wrong in the context actually. And these more complicated terms can be ambiguous as well if they have more than one potential meaning. So always prefer the more simple term where there are alternatives. I'll show you some examples in a minute. You want to minimize the confusion and maximize understanding, okay? And just because your science that you're trying to explain is maybe a little bit complicated, it doesn't mean the language needs to be. Do try and keep it simple and keep it relevant for your readers who, as I said, may not be native English speakers. And I like a quote from Albert Einstein here. He once famously said, if you can't explain your science in very simple terms, you actually don't understand it well enough yourself. And I think that's a very apt quote for this point. And these are just some examples where, there's perhaps these more complicated terms that can have more than one possible meaning. We'd always recommend using the simple term. Okay, moving on to section 2, journal selection. So I said that this is a very common reason for rejection, and I think it's really important to get this right. Okay, this is when most people fall down initially. They get rejected simply because they're submitted to a journal that's not the best choice. So how do we go about choosing a journal? When, indeed, should we choose the journal? So you need to know what results you're going to write about, what it is you're trying to publish first. Okay, so you make the decision after you've decided you have enough results for publication. And then, based on those results, you choose how high or low on the impact factor scale do we want to aim with this. Okay, do we have really exciting results and we can target a high impact factor journal, or is this an incremental advance and we're going to go for a more moderate impact factor journal? So you have an idea of this in advance. Also, after deciding how broadly relevant your findings are, as you know, some journals are very, very specific and tailored to a narrow field, they have a narrow readership. Other journals have a very wide readership and they have people right across that particular field. So, how broadly relevant, how widely of interest are these findings going to be? But I always recommend choosing the journal before writing the main body of your manuscript. So you may already have your methods written up, that's fine, and you have an idea of your results and tables and figures already laid out. But certainly the things like the introduction and discussion, and importantly as well the title and abstract, these should be left for last, and they should be written after you've chosen your journal. Because the requirements of one journal are very, very different from the requirements of another. And it would be silly to write a manuscript and then have to completely reformat the references or remove 1,000 words because you're over the word limit, or change a structured abstract to an unstructured abstract, for example. So do choose your journal and then write your article according to the journal's guide for authors, or instructions for authors. That's really important. And you can save yourself a lot of time doing that. Some factors to consider. Aims and scope, of course, are really important. You need to ensure that your research that you're communicating really fits in with the aims and scope of the journal. Okay, well, of course, we heard this morning in some of the talks about the mega journals that don't, there's never an article out of scope. Okay, and that's fine for those particular journals, but most journals do have a very clearly defined aims and scope, and you can go to their web pages and you can read what those aims and scope are. And if it's not a good match for your particular findings you're publishing, then you need to look for another journal, because there's a good chance you're going to get rejected if you submit there. Okay, so that's really important. Related to that is the readership of the journal. So if the journal editors are in touch with what their readers are interested in and wanting to read about, these should be quite closely related, but you want to consider, for example, in some of the medical fields, are the readers of this journal clinicians or the basic researchers in the lab, okay? It can be on exactly the same topic, cancer biology, for example, but the readerships are quite different. So you need to consider who's reading this journal, okay? That's really important. Open access is something we've heard a bit about this morning as well in the panel discussion. That's something that's really growing, and I think it's great for the industry. If you want to reach the widest possible audience with your research, then you might want to consider submitting to an open access journal, because then anybody, anywhere with an internet connection can access that research about it. And then the final thing here is the impact factor. And the importance of this varies a lot from field to field, okay? But I know in a lot of fields this is really important. It's an important factor for researchers. For example, if you're applying for a promotion or trying to get your next grant, maybe you need a high impact factor publication. So this is one of the factors that you need to consider. And you need to weigh all these things up and really just think about what's most important for you and what's the best match for your particular findings in this case. Okay, so these are all factors to consider, but how do you go about choosing a journal? Okay, you really need to ensure there's a balance here between the significance of the findings and the aims and scope and impact factor of the journal. Okay, but how do we do it? Well, it's all very well saying there needs to be a match or a balance, okay, but it's very difficult often for researchers to make an honest evaluation of their own work. Of course you think it's fantastic, you think it's really exciting, it's wonderful work, but you're very close to that. You're perhaps a bit too close to making objective decisions. So maybe you have to ask a friend or a colleague to assess it. But to help you on this, I want to break the significance down into a few different components. And the first of these is novelty. Now, all research to be published needs to be novel, okay? Journal editors are not interested in something that's been published before. That's not novel. So it needs to be novel, but there's different degrees of novelty. As we all know, some findings are going to revolutionize the field. They're completely unexpected and really exciting. They have a high degree of novelty. Other findings are more incremental. We did this body of work, this was our hypothesis, we confirmed it, and that's fine, of course it warrants publication, but it has perhaps slightly lower degree of novelty. Relevance, and I talked before about targeting a journal with the right readership, well, you need to think how broadly relevant are your findings. That's really important. And then appeal, and this is the sexiness of the topic. We've all heard the phrase hot topics. Well, what's a hot topic? Hot topics are those topics, those areas of research that perhaps a newspaper might pick up on and write a headline article about, or someone's going to go and blog about it, or people are going to tweet about it in their Twitter accounts, whatever it may be. These are the topics that have broad appeal to the wider public. And because journal editors are interested in citations, okay, because more citations means a higher impact factor for their journal, they're going to be interested in work in those hot topic areas, okay? It's logical. So these sorts of things have a higher level of significance as well. Does anyone know how many different journals there are out there? How many journals specifically with impact factors? I wonder. So I want to go through and show you some numbers here. In the Science Citation Index, okay, so these are journals in that particular index with impact factors, there are a little over 8,500. In the Social Science Citation Index, we have a little over 3,000. And in the Arts and Humanities, we have almost 1,500 journals. So that's an awful lot of journals that have impact factors. And then there are many, many more, of course, that don't even have impact factors yet. That may be applying for impact factors, but they're not indexed in the index. That's a lot of journals to choose from, and even within a specific field, there will be dozens of potential target journals. How do you, as researchers, choose the best one? Or even know, how do you work out which possible journals are there in my field that I could submit to? Having identified this as a challenge, particularly for non-native speakers of English who perhaps don't read as much of the literature as native English speakers do, because it takes longer and it's harder work. Okay, as a result of identifying this as a challenge, we came up with this tool called the Edanz Journal Selector, and it's free to use. It's available at this URL here. Okay, and I'd actually like to invite you all later on to come to our website and try it out. Perhaps put the abstract from your latest paper in, or if you're developing an article at the moment, put some keywords or text in, and I'll show you briefly how it works. So this is the entry page, and you can insert some text. It may be an abstract or keywords, or it can be more general, and you can choose. Okay, there's a drop-down list over here. But you insert your text, and you hit the go button, and you get a readout that looks a little bit like this. And this is just the top of a list, a whole list of them. And what it'll give you some potential target journals, okay? And there's the journal's aims and scope, the impact factor, and the publication frequency here on this page. Just briefly about what's behind this tool. Okay, so we've developed a very large database of, it's around now, I think we're up to about 50,000 abstracts from around 10 or 15,000 different journals, okay, a lot of journals. And we have essentially a fingerprint then based on the text for each of those journals. And when you insert your text here, we get a fingerprint for your particular article, okay? Certain keywords that appear and the frequency with which they appear give us a fingerprint for your text. And then it's kind of like the CSI, okay? It's like, you know, when they scan the database for the fingerprint to identify who did it, who's the criminal. The database matches the fingerprint for your text to the fingerprint for the nearest matched journals, okay? So these are journals that have published articles that use similar keywords with similar frequency. All right? It's called semantic matching technology. Having got these results, you can actually filter. Okay, you can filter these results further. You can filter by field of study if you want. Select an impact factor range within which you want to target. You can select only journals that are indexed, or only journals that are open access. And you can also filter on the basis of publication frequency. So this just shows a similar output, but now the results are filtered. And you can then sort. So having got your filtered list, you can now sort the list. How do we want to arrange this? Okay, so we can sort by relevance. So the fingerprint with the best match is the one that appears at the top. Or we can sort by impact factor. So then the highest or lowest impact factor is at the top. We can go through with that. Or based on publication frequency. And then having chosen, okay, I like the look of this one, developmental cell, I can click on that and go to another page that gives me more information. Okay, information such as a link to the author guidelines. And I've already told you should write paying attention to these guidelines. And also to the journal's homepage, the website. This one's really important. It also gives an output of similar published articles. So these are the articles in that journal that led to it having being a good fingerprint match. Okay? These are the articles that use similar keywords with similar frequencies to what's in the text. And you need to look at these and think, is this journal currently publishing similar articles? Or are all of these perhaps from 10 or 15 years ago? In which case, maybe the journal's taking a different direction. Okay, so you want to make sure they're currently interested in this. And indeed, you may well have published some of these, cited some of these articles in your manuscript. Okay, moving on now to manuscript structure. Okay, I talked before about the need to logically present your findings and to tell a story with your results. But where do we start? Okay, where should we start with actually developing a manuscript? So I want to take you through some tips and talk about some of the things we do in our business when we're developing manuscripts for clients in our medical writing business. Okay, I think figures are a great place to start. Figures and tables, actually. So your actual results. Okay, your findings are why you want to publish this work. Okay, so they are fundamental to this manuscript. So start with them because they form the basis of your manuscript. And And the first step then is to logically organize them. And I think an important point here is this does not need to be the order in which you obtained the results. Because often you go back and you perform some validating experiment, or you perform something, some other work that provides a bit of a rationale for some of the later experiments or some of the other ones that maybe you did first. Okay, so assemble them in an organized, logical kind of order that makes sense. So we have these figures and tables, a logical presentation, and we need to think, are there any gaps here? You know, does it logically flow from this to this to this to this, or do we need something else in there to make the full story, to make it clear? And if that's the case, it may be that you need to go back and do some additional analyses or other experiments and fill that gap, perhaps with another figure like this. Okay? And now we have a nice and logical story. Okay? We have results that make sense when assembled in this fashion. So use that as the basis, and then we can expand from that. And so we always, when we're developing manuscripts, we start with an outline. Actually, we go through two outline stages. We do a brief outline first, and then we get feedback from the authors and clients on that, and then we have a more extensive outline. And in an outline, if you imagine if you have bullet points, it's a lot easier to move things around, okay, or add or remove things, and you're not always having to reformat your manuscript, okay, we convert to a draft later on. So it makes sense. I think it's a great idea to use an outline first. And as you can see, you probably can't read the text, but we have the main sections, and under each there's just little headings like, you know, introduction, general background, related studies, problems in the field, and aims. And I'll go through each of these sections in more detail in a minute. But all the key points need to appear in that outline. Okay? So the background information needs to appear in the introduction, obviously. The methods will describe the analyses you used, the results, of course, the findings you'll present, and then the discussion as we have the interpretations, any limitations, and of course talking about the implications of the findings. So all these should appear on bullet points in your outline. So I'm going to go through them one by one. I'll start now with the introduction. Okay, and I think it's nice to think of an introduction as a little bit like an upside down triangle, okay, where we start out with a very general introduction. Okay, it's quite broad at this point. We're just trying to bring the reader in, tell them a little bit about, you know, where we're headed, what this is in general terms. Okay, and as we go through the introduction, we get more and more specific to our own individual study. Okay, so we go from general to talking about the current state of the field to a specific problem in the field that you've addressed, and then of course your aims. And your aims really need to be addressing the problem in the field. So, you know, hypothesis-based research, there's a particular problem, you know, we hypothesize that if we do this, we'll find that, okay, and we're trying to address this problem. Okay, and that's what editors like to see, and reviewers. So it's an upside-down triangle where we get more and more specific as we go through. Now, I don't expect you to read the text, but I just want to show a flow of information through an introduction section. So this is an article that was published in BMC Cancer, and the author started with a very general introduction. I'll just read the first sentence. Lung cancer is the leading cause of cancer mortality for men and women. Okay, it's very broad, very general, okay, but it very quickly comes to the point. Okay, they go from general introduction to some more specific information where they're talking about specific pathways that they're investigating and so on. And finish up by talking about their objectives, which of course are linked to their aim. Okay, so in the beginning of the introduction, you need to demonstrate the relevance and interest of your findings. You know, why is this topic relevant or of interest to readers? As I said, lung cancer is the leading cause of cancer mortality for men and women, and the survival rate is only 16% with current therapies. Okay, leading to an important problem in the field. New ways to treat or prevent lung cancer are therefore needed. Okay, so immediately the authors are establishing why there should be some interest in this work. And the aims need to directly address this. So having said new ways to treat or prevent lung cancer are needed, the authors go on to say this study explored the hypothesis that inhibition of this molecule would lead to, would inhibit lung cancer growth. Okay, so it's a very clear logical link between aims and their problem. Okay, moving now to the methods. This is perhaps the easiest section to write, but it's important to realise just how much information needs to go into it. This is the mistake a lot of authors make. They leave out important information that actually another researcher who was perhaps wanting to replicate your work would need to be able to go and do that. Okay, so it's really important that all that information is in there. So you need to explain what was used in terms of samples or participants, materials that were used, how the work was done. So very general methods. Often these can be cited, or specific techniques, in which case you need to go into all the detail required for someone to repeat that. And of course how the data got analysed as well, so the statistics, that needs to go in there as well. The results. So, you know, we've started out by framing our article around the results and assessing them logically. You want to present key points relating to each display item. So when you're writing the results, you already have your figures and tables. You've already assembled them in a logical order that makes a story. And now you just need to describe the key points relating to each. It's important to try and avoid getting into the implications of these findings, save that for the discussion, but really just give the key points for each figure and table. Another thing to avoid is too much duplication between text and figure or table. Okay, so if you've got all this data in the table, you don't need to then go and replicate that in the text. You can simply refer to the tables and say, you know, baseline characteristics are shown in table 1, for example. I think it's a nice idea to split result sections into subsections. We have a subsection for perhaps each result or each figure and table. And importantly with this, if you're doing that with your results, I think your methods need to match. So the methods section should also be broken into subsections. So a reader who wants to know, you know, they're interested in one particular finding, they want the method details for that finding, they can go directly to the relevant subsection. And then, as I said, you know, a factual description only. You're just going to talk about the key points. You're not getting into the implications yet. When talking about results, it's important to talk about display items. So these are figures and tables. There's a saying in English that a figure is worth 1,000 words, and I think there's an equivalent in Spanish as well, and it's very, very true. Figures and tables are a great way to get a lot of information across very quickly and efficiently. So do use them for that. Bear in mind as well that they're often the first thing readers will look at. Okay, they don't have time to read the whole manuscript. They just want to have a look at your results and they're going to look at the figures and tables. Perhaps they already understand the background, so they don't need to read that, and they'll draw their own conclusions about it. So they're only interested in that. Do try and keep figures and tables simple, okay, so they're easy to understand, and that means perhaps using separate panels if necessary to separate out some of the data. And because readers may only look at figures and tables, okay, they're not going to read the text perhaps, and perhaps they'll read the figure legends that accompany them, but that's all. The figure legends need to be able to stand alone, okay, that's really important as well. So all the information to understand the figure or understand the table needs to be included in the legend. Okay? Readers shouldn't have to go to the main text. And this is just from that same article in BMC Cancer. We've got a nice clear figure legend with a title for the experiment, brief details of the methods, description of the key findings. We've got these indicators here, arrows, arrowheads, and asterisks that are defined here in the figure legend. It's very clear and easy to understand exactly what's shown. So here, you know, the reader doesn't need to go to the main text to get details of what was done or what indeed is shown. Okay, that's nice and clear. It can stand alone. Just as the introduction is a little bit like an upside-down triangle, the discussion is really the opposite. So it's a triangle where we're going from very specific, talking about our own individual findings, okay, we get a summary of our findings, to broaden out and then talk about the relevance of these findings in a more broad context, comparing our results with those others. And we finish up very broad and general by talking about the implications for the field as a whole. Okay, so it's going the opposite direction to the introduction. And this is the same article in the MC Cancer, just going through an example here of the discussion section. The author started out by summarising their key findings, talking about the relevance by referring to previous studies, other work, and also unexpected results, okay, results that were maybe in contrast to some of the previously published. This isn't being ignored, they're actually discussing it, which is great. And they're talking about the limitations of the work, and this is really important as well, because peer reviewers are always looking for what things could have been done better. And if you include a section on the limitations, and I know a lot of authors are reluctant to do that because we're highlighting weaknesses in our work, why should you do that? Well, peer reviewers will look for those things, and if you can preempt that and comment on those, and perhaps explain why you couldn't do those other experiments that would have made your results stronger, then you will make the whole process of revising and responding to peer review a whole lot easier. Okay? And then broadening out further our conclusions, the major conclusions here and the implications for the field as a whole. Okay, so going from specific down to very broad at the end of the discussion. Okay, and so we end up with a little bit of an hourglass-like shape. And I've talked a couple of times about telling a story. Well, one way we tell a story is by linking ideas logically. Okay, and we can do this, of course, as I said before, by ensuring our objectives match the problem in the field that we've described. Okay, we do it by presenting results and figures that actually match the objectives. We set out to achieve this, and we got these results. There has to be a clear match there. And also, the implications, when you talk about the implications, these need to link back to that problem in the field. The rationale for why you did the work needs to somehow be linked to whatever conclusion you draw at the end. And so having these logical linkages throughout your manuscript really assists your reader to understand the importance of your work. If you don't have these, maybe the English is all great, it's well written, but the reader is still going to get a bit confused. Okay, but by having these linkages, you can help the reader really understand the importance of your work, and that's important. Just to go back to this paper, BMC Cancer, so you may remember the introduction. These guys said new ways to treat or prevent lung cancer are therefore needed. So this was the problem in the field, and their objectives matched that. Okay, the study explored the hypothesis that inhibition of this molecule would inhibit lung cancer growth. Right, so a good match there. And then all the way at the end, down in the discussion, their conclusion. Pharmacological or genetic inhibition of these two molecules reduces lung cancer proliferation. So we have a very clear linkage between the conclusion, the objectives, and the problem. Okay, and it just helps the reader understand the importance of this work. Okay, one thing I haven't talked about yet, because I've really only gone from introduction through the discussion, but now I want to move on to titles and abstracts. And these are worth discussing separately, because they are really important, okay? It's the first impression you give a lot of the time, and it's important to give good first impressions, okay? You want the peer reviewer, you want the editor to make a decision to send your manuscript to peer review. And if you have a terrible title that doesn't really capture the topic of your work, if the abstract's not very well written, they may simply decide to put it on a rejection heap, okay? So you really need to make a good first impression. And you do that through titles and abstracts. So a good title, of course, needs to cover the important points, okay, of your work. You want to summarize what your key findings are. There should be good keywords in there. So, when you think about, when you do a database search, a literature search, those searches are based on title words and keywords, okay? And so if your title is not really relevant and specific to the topic of your study, you could have some kind of title that's a little bit quirky, but doesn't actually speak specifically to the topic of your research. Maybe when people are searching the literature, they're not going to find your article because you haven't got the right words in the title. So it's really important to ensure that those keywords are in there so people actually find your article and they can read it and hopefully cite it. And it's important that titles are concise, okay? There's often a lot of information to get across, but we can't have a whole paragraph for a title. It can't be really, really long, or readers will just lose interest, okay? They have to be able to read it and understand the key points. Some things to avoid. We do still often see titles that have a question, and again, this can be a little bit quirky. I think a question's fine if you give the answer as well. But a lot of times we see a title that's just a question and no more. Okay, it tells the reader what you investigated, what's the topic of your research. It tells them nothing at all about what you found. Okay, like what's the answer? So what? Why should I read this article? If you want people to click on that in a literature search and actually read your abstract and hopefully download your article, you perhaps want to be giving a bit more information, just a question in your title. Abbreviations should be avoided because a lot of readers may not be familiar with those particular abbreviations. And the same applies to jargon, technical terms that some readers who may be interested in your research perhaps aren't that familiar with. So try and avoid those. And terms like new or novel, as I said, all articles to warrant publication need to be describing new or novel research. Okay? So every single paper should be new or novel in some sense. These tend to get overdone. Okay, authors get carried away. A new method for this, or new findings on that. Don't overdo it unless there really truly is some kind of revolutionary new method that everyone's going to want to come and use. Try and avoid terms like that. So really, to boil it down, it's just a concise summary of the main finding or findings of your manuscript. Now, the abstract is really the first impression of the paper once people go past the title, and it's where you need to convey the relevance of your aims. So why you did what you did, and then the importance of your results. Okay, so why you did what you did, and then the results that you obtained, why are these really important? Why should people want to read about it? You also need to convince people of the validity of your conclusions. Okay, there needs to be enough information in there that convinces people that the experiments you did were enough to be certain about these results. It's where readers will judge your writing style. So an abstract should really be well written. I know, as I said, we're an editing and writing company. When we're editing or developing a paper, we spend a lot more time on the abstract per word than we would on any other part of the paper. Okay, because it's really important to get it well written, flowing logically, obviously complying with word limits, but nice and clear. So the writing style is really important. And often it's the only part of the paper that will be read. Okay, I talked before about figures and tables, saying some readers will only look at those and perhaps read the figure legends. In other cases, they might go as far as reading the abstract, but that's it. Researchers are very, very busy people. There are far more papers on their desk than they can possibly go and read. So often they'll just read the abstract, and that gives them all the information they need to know. In terms of sections of an abstract, I've said it really has to be a concise summary of your research, but what needs to go in there? Well, it's important to have some background information so the reader can understand why the study was done. Okay, this is the rationale. So having given a little bit of background and described a problem in the field, they can understand, okay, that's why these guys went into that particular work. Okay, so that kind of background is really important. The aims, which need to relate to this problem, you'll describe your hypothesis. The methods, brief description of the techniques you use, what approach. We're just talking very general here, not the details of methods, but we use this particular approach to address this problem. The vast majority of your abstract should be describing the results, okay? And again, if you have a lot of results, you may not have all of them in there. You perhaps don't need to explain all of the validated experiments you did to ensure that your results are correct. But the most important findings do need to be conveyed here. And then finally, this is often only one, maybe two sentences at the end, the conclusions and implications of your work, of your findings. A lot of abstracts will use subheadings like those to set out those particular pieces of content in the abstract. But others, some journals, have an unstructured abstract. It's just a single paragraph. Okay, but to help you out here, all of the same things need to go into that single abstract. All that's missing is the headings, the subheadings in the abstract. Okay, so we still need to have the background that gives, describes the rationale and sets up the problem and the aims of our study. We still need to give some details of the methodological approach, describe our findings, and of course give the conclusion or conclusions to them. So all of the same things have to go into the abstract, even without those subheadings. And just as we logically link ideas in our main text, we can logically link the ideas in the abstract. So here a slightly different example, moving on to a different area. However, the mechanophysical properties associated with ethereal morphogenesis of polyatoms. There's the problem, and the solution, or the answer to the problem, should be found in the conclusion. Thus, coordinated rotational movement is a unique mechanophysical process. So we give a problem and then link to that as this conclusion. So yeah, journal editors are pretty busy. Often they're researchers themselves. Okay, so they're full-time managing a lab, they're applying for grants, they're teaching, they're looking after students. They've got a huge number of things on their plate already, and in their spare time, whatever time they have, they're also editors on this particular journal. Okay, they're hugely busy, and as I said at the beginning, journal editors are receiving more and more submissions all the time relative to the available publication space in the journal. So they have to make decisions about which articles to send for peer review and which ones to reject. So how do you convince them to send your article to the peer reviewers? Well, you need to write a good cover letter. And when I started in this business, I used to see letters from people that were basically just, dear editor, please find my manuscript attached. Look forward to hearing from you. Thanks. Okay. That does nothing to sell your manuscript to the editor. Okay. So bearing in mind this competition that's out there, you need to kind of take your scientist hat off for a minute and put your salesman hat on and actually write a convincing cover letter that will persuade the journal editor to send your manuscript to peer reviewers. So what needs to go into your cover letter? What are some things? So just as the abstract's the first impression you give to readers, the cover letter is often the first impression you give journal editors. So you need to have in your letter, somehow you need to convey the significance and relevance of your work. Why is this important? How does it relate to the readers? Why would it be of interest to the readers? Show the journal editor that you've taken the time and effort to go to the journal website, read their aims and scope, and understand who their readers are. If you can convey those things in your cover letter, already you're on the right side of that journal editor. They're liking you, okay? And then also, the level of English. They're going to make a decision about, how well written is this? And if a letter's really badly written, they probably won't have much confidence that the article will be either. So just, no need to read the text now, I just want to go through the parts of a good cover letter. Okay? I think it's great if you can address the journal editor by name. Okay? In the example I gave before, dear editor, that's not very personal. Okay? All journals on their website will say who the editor or editor-in-chief or managing editor or whoever you need to write to, who that person is. You can address the letter directly to that person, write to them by name. Okay, in the first sentence, you need to convey the manuscript title, but also the publication type you want to achieve. And again, this shows that you've taken the time to go to a journal website. Maybe you've read that journal, so you're familiar with what they're publishing and the different publication types. So in some articles it might be called an original article, in some journals it might be called an original article, and others a research article. Or we may have a brief communication, or any other of a number of different types of publication type. So show them that you've taken the time to look. I want it to go in this section of your journal, it's this type of paper. You need to very briefly give the background so the editor can understand why you did the work you did. And of course describe briefly what was found and what you did to obtain those results. So these are just very brief kind of introduction methods of results. It doesn't have to be a huge amount of detail, just enough to understand that. I I think the most important paragraph here, though, is the next one. It's where you convey the interest. Why would readers of that journal be interested in these particular findings? So again, having looked at the aims and scope, and having understood who the readers are, you can directly tell the editor that your readers will be interested in this because whatever that reason may be. So do try and make that linkage, because it's going to make it more likely that the editor will then send it for peer review, that they'll be interested. And then this point at the bottom, reviewers. So a lot of journals now more and more are asking authors to recommend potential reviewers for their article. And if that's the case, they can go into your cover letter as well. And finally, there are a number of must-have statements, and I'd just briefly like to talk about these. Most of these actually relate to publication ethics, and I've given whole talks on this topic of publication ethics. In a forum like this, we don't really have time to go much into detail on that, but a lot of these things are covered in the cover letter where the journal, the publisher, the editor are putting the onus on you, the author, to make particular statements that really just covers these technical issues. Okay, so what are they? First of all, that the research being submitted is original and is not been published elsewhere. Okay, so often in the instructions for authors you'll see written, you must include a statement to this effect. And this is really just ensuring that there's not redundant, possibility of redundant publication or duplicate publication. That it's not been submitted to another journal. Okay, so this is where the whole duplicate thing comes in. You can only submit to one journal at a time. If you end up waiting a long time and you don't hear back, you can't just then go and submit to another journal. You actually need to write to the first one, retract that submission, and then you may go and submit elsewhere. Okay? So a statement to the effect this is not being considered elsewhere. A statement to the fact that all authors agree on the paper and everything in the paper, and also the journal being submitted to. So all the authors have read and approved the final version of the manuscript. And this is really important as well, because journal editors, being busy people, don't have time to be a policeman as well. They don't have time to kind of deal with authorship disputes and try and keep everybody happy. They expect that you, the corresponding author, have already done this, ensured that everyone agrees with the final version, so then they can just make a decision about the quality of the manuscript. Okay, so they want a statement about that. Statements about conflict of interest. This is something I encounter a lot being in the medical writing industry and working with pharmaceutical companies and authors who are often sponsored by pharmaceutical companies. So they have relationships with those companies that maybe pay an honorarium, or they pay for them to go to this conference or that. None of those things are a barrier to publication. Okay? These are not a problem. Okay? All that is important is that these potential conflicts of interest are disclosed. So it's just about transparency. And a lot of authors are very reluctant to disclose this because they think, oh, there's going to be a problem if I have all this about this. But actually there is no problem, it just needs to be disclosed. So the reader who is reading the article and the findings knows the context within which these findings were obtained. Okay? So a statement about conflicts of interest, and often that's included in the manuscript as well. Sources of funding, and this is related, who's paid for this research? If it's funded by a pharmaceutical company and the findings are going to improve the share price of that pharmaceutical company, again, it's fine that pharmaceutical companies fund research, that's great. It's just about being transparent. So who's paid for this research? It needs to be conveyed. And then authorship contributions as well. So again, because journal editors don't want to be policemen, they also want to ensure that everyone who's contributed is included in the right place. And if someone has perhaps just assisted with some of the statistics, but they didn't contribute to the design of the study or obtaining the results, maybe they don't qualify for authorship. In that particular case, they would be acknowledged in the acknowledgement section. Okay, so you've got to ensure that the criteria for authorship are all complied with. Journal editors need to know that, but they put the onus on the corresponding author to ensure that's the case. And often, they'll be asking what are the contributions of the authors. Okay, I said before, more journals are now asking that you recommend potential peer reviewers. I'm just going to show you a couple of examples. Two Springer journals. So the first one here, Frontiers of Chemical Science and Engineering. When submitting a paper, authors are requested to suggest 5 potential peer reviewers or referees. Okay. In this other journal, Experimental Brain Research, the editors go a step further. They not only ask that you provide the contact details for 5 peer reviewers, but they say if you do not do so, your paper will be returned unreviewed. And indeed, on the submission web pages of many journals now, you cannot actually complete the submission process unless you put reviewer information. If the journal's requiring that, they won't allow you to complete submission and upload it until that information is pushed. But how do we decide who's a good potential peer reviewer? Where do we find these potential peer reviewers? I think, a logical place is through our reading. The articles we read, the articles we've cited in our manuscript. Often the authors of those will be excellent potential peer reviewers. But also through networking at conferences. And this is a great place to see where, what people are working on now. Not just based on what they've already published, but what they're going to publish next because they're presenting their new work at that conference. Okay? So you can see whether perhaps your findings are consistent with what they're currently working on, or is it consistent with their hypotheses and theories, or perhaps contradictory. And if you're going down a different track to those other authors, then maybe they're not the best potential peer reviewers because they'll disagree with whatever you've concluded. So you can make a decision about who you want to recommend there. Seniority of the researcher is important. It's easy to go and identify the person at the top of the lab, the lab head, the Nobel Prize winner in the field. But if it's an incremental advance and going to a relatively modest impact factor journal, maybe that's not the best person to choose because they're very likely to reject the invitation to be peer reviewer. So if it is a modest advance going to a journal with a modest impact factor, you maybe want to look at the next tier down. It could be a senior postdoc in the lab or someone who's just established themselves as an independent researcher. And then some people to avoid. So I already mentioned you might want to avoid those people whose thoughts, whose theories are perhaps going to contradict your own based on their current work. But also try and avoid collaborators from the last few years and researchers from the same institute. Okay? Journal editors aren't dumb. Okay, and they want reviewers who are going to be completely objective in terms of assessing your manuscript. So if they look at your previous publications and who you've currently worked at, and they look at the previous publications of the reviewers you're recommending, and they see that actually you've co-published with some of these, or they're at the same institute, maybe those people aren't going to be as objective as someone else, so they're unlikely to appoint those people as reviewers. And then you want to internationalise the list as well. So, maybe a couple from the Americas, North or South or Central America, a couple from Asia, and a couple from Europe. Okay, final section, I want to talk about peer review. Okay, and I'm going to start by talking about the submission process and the process for peer review and timeframes. So, your manuscript obviously goes off to the journal editor who makes a decision whether to send it for peer review or not. Okay, they're going to think, are these results novel? Is the topic relevant? Have the journal requirements been met? And hopefully they're not going to reject, because if you've followed the instructions for authors and written your manuscript well according to the advice I've given, and you've written a good cover letter, hopefully all these boxes get ticked, and your article goes off for peer review. Okay, now this could take anything from sort of 3 or 4 weeks with some of the really rapid journals that offer rapid peer review, okay, to perhaps a couple of months with some of the smaller ones. But I've heard stories, particularly in Brazil actually, where some researchers have waited 6 months or even up to a year before receiving a decision. Now, I think that's terrible. I think with most of the bigger international publishers, you would never get that. One of the things the publishers do is they're always checking the statistics for the journals, how long are these processes taking, ensuring that the journal editors are actually doing a good job. So if it gets to kind of 6 weeks, I'd be sending a follow-up email to the journal editor. Hey, just waiting on a decision, how long is it going to be? If after 2 months you've had nothing, then you might want to consider retracting that submission and going elsewhere. Okay? You don't want to be waiting forever because someone else could publish the same results and you end up being sued. So the peer review comments come back and generally revisions are needed. It's very, very rare that an article is accepted immediately after peer review. And so these revisions could be some new experiments, improving readability, so just maybe it needs to come to a company like us to edit the manuscript, or adding some of the information that's missing. Usually this is in the methods. And then back to the editor and hopefully accept it after that. It's worth thinking about some of the things reviewers are looking at. Of course they're going to assess the science, so they need to know that there's a relevant hypothesis, that there's good experimental design and that the methodology is appropriate, that the data analysis was done correctly and you have proper presentation of results, the results are being presented in the correct format, the most appropriate format, and that the conclusions are valid and are supported by the results. So all of these things need to come through in different sections of the manuscript. Now they're also going to assess the manuscript itself. So really they're looking for a logical flow of information. In the first section of my talk, I covered that a little bit, writing effectively. That the structure and formatting are appropriate for the journal. That the references you've cited are all appropriate as well. Okay, that it's not unbalanced. They're not only citing papers that are maybe agreeing with your own findings and ignoring other papers that show something different. And readability, ensuring that it's good and easy to read. So what do we do if we need to do these revisions? Okay, there's two things. We need to develop a response letter where we respond to every single reviewer comment, and we also need to revise our manuscript. I think it's important to make these changes easy to see. Okay, so we can refer to them in the response letter by page number and line number, but also in the manuscript itself, we can use a different colour font or maybe highlight to make those changes stand out. It just makes the journal editor's job a little bit easier. When you write a response letter, again, address the editor personally. Bear in mind this might be a different editor to the one you wrote the cover letter to. Okay? It's whoever handled your submission that perhaps got appointed to a particular editor, they handle that submission. That's who you write back to. Do include the reference ID number that your manuscript will have been assigned. I think it's important to thank the reviewers, even if they're making your life a little bit harder, they're performing this service for free, and they're actually doing it to help you improve the quality of your submission, to make it as strong as it can be when it becomes somewhat permanent in the scientific literature. So it's important to thank them for their time. And then in the letter as well, you can highlight any major changes. Perhaps if there's something that all of the reviewers commented on, it would be a good place to say, yeah, we've addressed this point raised by all the editors. But most of the detail of these responses come not in the letter, but in the response, point-by-point responses, okay, that should follow. And I just want to give an example here, because there's different ways. Sometimes we agree with what the reviewer said, or they made a very good point. Other times we may disagree, and we need to rebut the point. So I want to give examples. So I'm going to read this comment. In your analysis of the data, you've chosen to use a somewhat obscure fitting function. In my opinion, a simple Gaussian function would have sufficed. Moreover, the results would be more instructive and easier to compare to previous results. So, in our response, let's say in this example we agree. We think, actually, that's a really good point, Mr. Reviewer or Mrs. Reviewer. We agree with the reviewer's assessment. Okay, our tailored function in its current form makes it difficult to tell that this measurement constitutes a significant improvement. We describe our new analysis using a Gaussian fitting function. Okay, so the authors have gone away, they've reanalyzed the data using this particular model in our revised results section. And actually, to make it easy for the editor, they've included page and line numbers. And in the text, these changes will be highlighted as well. Okay, so that's an example where we agree. But sometimes actually the reviewers misunderstood something important, okay? We disagree with them when we talk about exactly the same comment, okay? But in this case we disagree. Here in our response we're writing, okay? Although a simple Gaussian fit would facilitate comparison with the results of other studies, our tailored function allows for analysis of the data in terms of the Smith model. And we're providing support for our approach by citing this particular article, okay? We're saying this is the model we chose to use and this is why. However, it's not just enough to leave it at that, to say, well, we did it like this because of this. We need to still revise the manuscript because other readers may come to the same conclusion as the reviewer, the same misunderstanding. So we have now explained the use of this function and the Smith model in our revised discussion section. And again, page and line numbers. So we're providing evidence, we're making revisions in the manuscript to avoid similar misunderstandings again, and we're giving the page and line numbers in the text. Okay? So, same thing, but we disagree. Now sometimes reviewers just appear to be being a bit unfair or just plain mean. And I'll read this comment out. Currently the author's conclusion that this gene is involved in heart development is not completely validated by their in vitro analyses. They should do additional in vivo experiments using the genetic mouse model to show that heart development is regulated by this gene. Now I don't know how many biologists we have here, hopefully most of you, but for those of you who don't know, to do this kind of work, to create a mouse model and do these in vivo experiments is going to be very, very costly, probably millions of dollars, lots of money. It's going to take a very, very long time. Now, if your submission was to Nature or a similar journal, maybe that's actually what's required. Okay, and you can go and look at previous articles, and if all the previous articles have in vivo evidence, then okay, maybe we need to do that, or we retract our submission and we try something else, perhaps with a more modest impact. So it might not be that the review is being unfair, but actually, this is what is required to be published. However, if you see other articles that are solely based on in vitro evidence, similar to yours, then you can go back and rebut the point. You can say to the journal editor, hey, I've seen these other articles in your journal, these other authors didn't do this, we don't think we need to. Okay, so be realistic. And it may be that they're being a bit mean, or it may be that there's a good reason for that point. Okay, so you need to consider those things. Okay, finally, if accepted, okay, Yahoo, we're popping champagne corks and celebrating, that's great. We've overcome these barriers. But our work is not quite yet done. Okay, there's more we can do because your goal should not only be to be published, but actually to be cited, to be widely read and cited as well. So how can we help to promote, obviously the publishers are going to do this, but how can we help to promote our own work? Well, these days social networks are one way you can do this. You can blog about it or tweet about it. You can write post-publication comments on the journal website. And of course presenting your work at conferences is a great way to make people aware of that. So just to summarise the kind of main sections again, it's really important to write effectively, to choose the best journal, okay, really a common reason for rejection, to tell a story and logically present your results, to convey the significance of your work to journal editors, and to properly revise your manuscript after peer review. And I hope that some of these tips I've given you today will help you to do all those things and publish in better journals as well. Now I know it's half past, but we're about 10 or 15 minutes late starting. I just have a few more slides. So who are we at Edanz? We're an editing company, as I said. And we work with authors, but also with institutions, and together with publishers like Springer. We've worked together with Springer for many years now. And so we really help authors to get their work published. Editing is the main work we do, but there are other services as well. And I think it's important to mention all of our editors and native speakers of English. They all have a research track record themselves, so they publish their own papers. They understand the content. It's not like other companies where they're using perhaps students who are native English speakers, or perhaps they are experts but they're not native English speakers. So we have people who have both. They have high level of language skills and so on. Just a couple of quick profiles. I'm going to skip over this quickly actually. because I want to allow some time for questions as well. We work very closely with Springer and some other publishers as well, Biomed Central, AIP. We're also members of COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics. And in terms of our services, well, I've mentioned the editing, but we can help you assess what services you might need. As well as editing, we do help with things like choosing a journal. We offer a pre-submission peer review service, cover letter development, help you identify reviewers who you might want to recommend, or write a real killer abstract, for example. And this is just in terms of the time frame from preparation through to submission to the journal, where some of these particular services fit in. Okay. So, as I mentioned earlier, come to the website, download the presentation if you want, try out our journal selection tool, which we think is pretty neat, and a lot of authors have told us that they found it really useful. So do come and try that out. Thank you very much for your attention today, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Muchas gracias. Si no hay preguntas para Daniel, permítanme entonces solamente entregarle un reconocimiento. A nombre del Consorcio Nacional de Recursos de Información Científica y Tecnológica, se otorga y presenta reconocimiento a Daniel McGowan por su participación en este taller. Muchísimas gracias por su participación. Si hay alguna pregunta que tengan ustedes después para Daniel, él va a estar en la serie del área de los stands con Springer, y ahí lo pueden encontrar y hacerle cualquier pregunta que ustedes tengan posteriormente. Muchas gracias a todos. Gracias.